Hello again, 102. In this part 2 video, I will go over the reasons why the United States was drawn into the Great War, and that will complete the first question in its entirety. President Wilson maintained that the United States was too proud to fight in Europe's war. Again, our historic policy is isolationism, and we don't get involved in the military and political affairs of the Europeans. And those causes cannot touch us. He hoped that Americans are going to remain neutral in thought as well as actions to the events going on in Europe. Privately, however, he's not neutral. He sought to provide Great Britain and France with as much financial assistance and supplies as possible, because these are our historic allies. And he views the Central Powers as being something that really needs to be put down. That was more easily said than done, maintaining neutrality, as I mentioned earlier, because there are many hyphenated Americans. And this war, just briefly before I go on any further, this war will end all romantic notions of war because of the vast slaughter that goes on and the millions of lives that were lost and the hundreds of thousands of cripples that came out of this war. That will end romantic notions of war that people like Theodore Roosevelt held as it being the great adventure of manhood. That will no longer be the case after the First World War. And we talked about the fact that these hyphenated groups were still opposed to Britain or had allegiances to Germany. By the spring of 1915, the Allied powers' desperate need for food and supplies had generated an economic boom for American businesses, bankers, and farmers. The country is booming. All kinds of area in the Midwest that probably should not have been farmed is now under cultivation. And that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, as we'll see. American exports to France and Britain quadrupled in those 2 years. And to finance their record-breaking purchases of American supplies, allies, especially Britain and France, needed loans from U.S. banks and credits from the U.S. government in order to allow them to pay for purchases later. And Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan at the beginning tried to practice strict neutrality, as was historically done by the United States. And Wilson was gone out of Washington for a time because his first wife had passed away, and he was going through the funeral proceedings and the interment of her remains. And when he comes back to Washington, he is furious because they're going to make a lot of money off of this. We're not going to stay neutral when it comes to this kind of business. And more than $2 billion worth is going to be sent to the Allies, as opposed to only $27 million to Germany. You know, hypocrisy is a way of life, ladies and gentlemen, right? When it comes to the almighty dollar, the U.S. usually wants to make the buck before we're going to worry about high-minded principles. And Secretary Bryan will call upon the warring nations to respect the rights of all neutral nations at the beginning, which means that we should be able to ship goods across the Atlantic without being bothered. And the Central Powers accepted this, but Britain did not, because they will try and search the cargoes of vessels if they are bound for Germany. And a few months later, they announced that they would seize any ships that were carrying goods to Germany. They are practicing a kind of continental system that Napoleon had practiced in the beginning of the 19th century, attempting to starve out Britain. Now the Brits will use it against the Germans as well. And as a result of that, they are going to have to use their submarines to fight back, because the Germans kept them bottled up. And as a result, the German government then proclaimed a war zone around the British Isles. All ships that are going to approach Britain are going to be attacked if they are suspected of carrying war goods. And this will be carried out by the Untersee boats, or the German submarines. And this is going to lead to problems with passenger liners like the Lusitania. The U-boat was one of their big weapons in the First World War. And they are attacking merchant ships, not just military vessels, and neutral nations at the beginning in 1914 and 15. And eventually this will lead to the sinking of the ocean liner, the Lusitania, and 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans, and this caused international outrage. And at this time, President Wilson does not respond with any sort of war declaration or asking for war or anything. He maintains that this needs to stop. And again, we've talked about his ideas of a nation being too proud to fight, and you don't have to resort to force in order to prove your point. But he will move away from those positions in a couple of years. But he had also said that any sort of sinking of American vessels or the losing of any American lives is going to result in strict accountability from the Germans. And Secretary Bryan signed a letter demanding that they abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. This is one of the big reasons, ladies and gentlemen, for the American entry into the Great War, and to pay reparations to the families of those killed in the sinking of the Lusitania. The Germans responded that the ship was armed, which it was not, but that it secretly carried cargoes of rifles and ammunitions. And that was true. And that might have hastened the sinking of the Lusitania, because some of that ammunition blew up, and that blew that ship apart, and it went to the bottom. And they're stunned by the global outcry over this. So the German government tells its captains to quit attacking passenger vessels. But despite the order, a German submarine sunk the British liner Arabic, and 2 Americans were killed. The Germans paid a cash penalty to their families and issued what came to be called the Arabic Pledge in September of 15. Liners will not be sunk by our submarines without warning. In other words, the submarines will surface and say what they are going to do, and they're not going to take the lives of non-combatants, provided that the liners do not try to escape or offer resistance. So basically, they are now engaging in restricted submarine warfare. And then in March of 1916, the French ferry Sussex was sunk, and it injured 2 Americans, and now Wilson threatens to break off diplomatic relations. And they renew their pledge again. And the Sussex pledge was far stronger than the German promise after the Arabic sinking the year before. And for a time, they're going to abandon submarine warfare. And after the Lusitania sinking back on the home front, Wilson asks the War and Navy departments to develop plans for a $1 billion military expansion. And many Americans, including the pacifist Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who now resigns his office because of this, and other progressives and a lot of Midwest Republicans, are opposed to these plans because they believe that Wilson is dragging the country into war, and Bryan actually enunciated that in public. But despite such opposition, Congress passed the National Defense Act, and now the Army is going to slowly start to grow. Now, in the fall of 1916, Wilson runs for re-election under this famous slogan, "He kept us out of war." And it didn't look too good. It was a very, very close election. The Republican Charles Evans Hughes, a former progressive governor of New York, is the Republican candidate. And Theodore Roosevelt was so sure that Hughes had won. Hughes will go on, ladies and gentlemen, as we'll see, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the 1930s. And he'll have problems with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Theodore is so sure that he won that he sent him a congratulatory telegram. But Wilson ekes out a win in California by 4,000 votes, and he makes American political history, becoming the first Democrat to win a second consecutive term since Andrew Jackson in 1832. Now we come to the final 2 reasons for the U.S. declaration of war. There are three main ones, ladies and gentlemen. One, we had a lot invested in the Allies. $2 billion. Two, unrestricted submarine warfare. And the last one, the Zimmermann telegram. In the beginning of 1917, the Germans are desperate and they announced the resumption of unrestricted sub-warfare in the Atlantic. All vessels from the United States headed to Britain, France, or Italy would be sunk without warning. And this was practically ordering the United States off the Atlantic, said an angry William McAdoo, Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury. Freedom of the seas, said the newspaper Brooklyn Eagle, will now be enjoyed only by icebergs and fish. Lastly, there was a message sent by German officials to the Mexican government urging the invasion of the United States, and the British intelligence services intercepted this message. And now, when this becomes public, many are going to ask for the declaration of war. Why? Because Germany will promise to the Mexicans in return for the invasion that they can get the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back. And on March 1st, this went public, infuriating Americans, and now public opinion is intensifying for war against Germany. A New York newspaper said the telegram was final proof that the German government has gone stark mad. And in March of 1917, they sank 5 U.S. ships in the North Atlantic. That's the last straw. Wilson appears in person in front of the Congress, asking for a declaration of war. And in this speech, he insisted that the world must be made safe for democracy and free from war. Wilson said the United States was entering the war not so much to defend the nation or its honor as to lead a great crusade, to end wars forever. This is the war now to end all wars, which will prove to be an unattainable goal that would eventually lead to great disillusionment. For now, however, the Congress erupted into a roar of approval. Not everybody supported it in the House or in the Senate, but the overwhelming majority of the Congress approved this declaration of war. Now the United States is involved in the Great War.